When something's lost, sometimes it's best to go back to the last place we remember having it and retrace our steps. We might not find it, but by God's grace, we might learn something along the way. It's a game that a lot of people think is like baseball, but without the glitz or the gloves. It doesn't require much to play, save an old broomstick handle or an old broom handle or a tennis ball or their equivalent. The field changes depending on whether we're in the city or in the suburbs, but stickball is basically the same wherever you play it. You don't need very much equipment. Bases are made of whatever you find around: a manhole cover, a street sign, an old box lid. And there are always at least a few special rules put into place to make sure that the integrity of the game is maintained. That is, no sliding, no stealing, no hopping the fence, and absolutely no crying. There's no crying in stickball. The games are made up of whomever happens to be in the neighborhood, and they go and go until either the street lights come on or there's no one left to play. A reminder that just like life, it's hard to play alone. Think back with me for a moment. Before we had bills to pay, before we had to worry about insurance or taxes or health care or grocery shopping, before we had to shave or make an online profile or worry about being a Democrat or a Republican, before we had to pluck our eyebrows or trim our nose hairs, before any of the stuff of adulthood, most of us were children. Sure, some of us were better at it than others, and some of us never quite left, but almost all of us were kids. It might seem hard to remember now, given all that has happened, but it's true. And while no two childhoods are the same, we recognize that some of us had it easier than others. Some of us had homes to live in, and some of us not. Some of us had people who cared, and some of us not. Some of us had the privilege of race or class or gender, and some of us not. And yet there's something that almost all children have that adults too often lack: hope. Childhood is about hope. And though throughout this summer we've seen too many children robbed of that hope, we know that at its best, childhood is a time that is supposed to be about hope. It's that time when we believe that anything is possible, when we assume the best about people, when we're not afraid to knock on our neighbor's door to see if they want to play. When was the last time we did that? How many of our neighbors do we even know? No, there comes a time, friends, hard to pinpoint as it's different for each of us, when we put an end to childish ways. When we stop going out to play, when we stop assuming the best about people, when we get too busy to meet our neighbors. And it's often at that moment that we leave our hope out on the playground and try to go on, convincing ourselves that we're better off on our own, that nobody really wants to play with us, that life is serious business. And too often when we leave that hope behind, we pick up a cynicism that robs us of life. But the good news, friends, is that it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. Our children know it innately. We should pay attention to the children around us or the ones that are still inside us dying to get out because they're trying to tell us something about what it means to fully live. And if we can just get back to that moment, if we can find our way back to that childlike wonder at the world, we just might find that hope is still there, ready to be picked up. And so today, on this tent Sunday, on this day when we come outside to play on our front lawn, at the beginning of this week when we try and get to meet some of our neighbors, we pause for a moment as children of the same God to try and recapture some of what has been lost. Fortunately for us, there are games to remind us of that as well. Maybe you know this one. There are lots of versions of this game, of course, but the most basic one begins with one person being it. That is, the person given some authority, a little power. Sometimes it goes to their head. They're given a little power, and then they're asked to seek while everyone else hides. It's a pretty basic game. You don't need very much skill, just a little creativity and a whole lot of patience. There's no equipment needed. People just go out and they seek while others hide. And as the game goes on, once the person who's it finds their first person hidden, that person joins and they begin to seek the second person together, and so on and so forth. And the great thing about hide and seek is that it doesn't end until everyone is found. A reminder to us that even though it's hard to admit, somewhere deep down, all of us long to be found. Jeremiah was found pretty early in his life. We have that first chapter of Jeremiah, which reminds us of God saying to Jeremiah, "Before you were formed in the womb, I knew you." The same thing is true for us. That's some good news. But we don't really know a whole lot else about Jeremiah's childhood, though we presume that, like most of us, he had one. We presume that he was a child running around, playing some games, getting into a little bit of trouble, though we don't know a whole lot about where that happened, save that it was in the land of the tribe of Benjamin, which was the northern part of the Judean countryside, the very southernmost part of the fallen Israeli kingdom. That is, he found a place in rural Judea, and now as an adult, he was a big prophet in the big city, speaking the word of God, and sometimes it went well, and sometimes it didn't. I know the feeling. He was out sharing, and then when we join him today, things are not going particularly well. See, when he's there in Jerusalem, it's surrounded by the Babylonian Empire. That is, they've come in, they've conquered already the rest of Judea, and Jerusalem is under siege. And people are starting to naturally freak out a little bit, and Jeremiah is not helping because he's just telling the truth. That is, that the city is getting ready to fall, that the temple will be destroyed, and that the king will be taken into captivity. And naturally, the king was a little frustrated by him bumming everyone out. And so, accusing him of treason, he throws Jeremiah in jail. And it's there that we find him today, in a jail cell in Jerusalem, near a crumbling city, surrounded by a conquering army. Maybe we've been there. Not there literally, but we know the feeling, don't we? We know what it's like to be at one of those moments in life when it feels like we're totally surrounded by the stuff of life, when we're overwhelmed by something that we're facing that we don't quite know how it happened, when we aren't quite sure of our way forward. Maybe some of us are there today. And in those moments, we often find ourselves asking that age-old question, how did I get here? And it's so simple in those moments to long for a simpler time, To go back to those times when we were stress-free, when we didn't have to worry about all the stuff of life. We go back to those nights when we could just play outside, capture the flag, or Ghosts in the Graveyard, or Red Rover, Red Rover. Maybe we remember that one. That's the one where two lines form and there's a chain of person on either side, and they call one out. Red Rover, sends Stephen right over, and you run over trying to break through the line, or at least break an arm. And you go through, and if you manage to break the line, you bring one of them over to your side, and if you don't, then you join their side. But either way, the game only ends when everyone's on one side. Again, a lesson for life. The game only ends when everyone finds their way to the same side. Maybe it was Jeremiah. Maybe it was Red Rover that Jeremiah was thinking about, or the ancient Near Eastern equivalent. But for some reason, as he's sitting there in that jail cell, he starts to think about the field of his cousin. That family field. Maybe he used to play games out there late into the night. Maybe it was the place where he remembered a little hope, a little joy, and he hears that voice of God say, "Buy that field," which, to be clear, is a really ridiculous thing to do. It's already under foreign occupation. The city is about to fall. Jeremiah is going to be taken into captivity, and he decides to stop and buy a field, to spend his money, and to have all the witnesses around see that he's doing it, and put it in an earthenware jar for safekeeping. He decides to risk a little hope. To be clear, he knew that Jerusalem was going to fall. He was the one telling the truth about that. Perhaps a reminder to those of us who find ourselves in a bit of a mess, that if we are ever going to get out of this quagmire we're in as a world, as a nation, as a community, it will take telling the truth. We've gotten used to lies lately. We need to tell the truth. That is, to speak the truth. And trust that as Jesus Christ promised, the truth will set us free. Jeremiah had to tell the truth, but he also knew that if he was going to find his way out of this, he needed to play the long game. That is, life goes on. That there will be a time after this present disorder. That there will be a time when this isn't the way things are, and we have to look for that time, even if we're not there to see it. And so he buys a field. He risks a little hope. And he invites others to dream. The truth is, friends, this is a hard moment for our world. I can't be the only one who feels it. There is a malaise that seems to have fallen over, pitting neighbor against neighbor, family member against family member, congregant against congregant. We know what it feels like, right? And we've gotten used to it. We are surrounded, besieged, not by a conquering army, but by a political, ideological split that we can't seem to find our way across. It's like a game of Red Rover where instead of sending people across, we just keep taking a step back and wondering why the game won't ever end. Sure, we all bemoan the division and the divides that we find ourselves in, but none of us are finding the way to get past it. Which means that things like this summer happen where we watch families and children separated from one another, and because we're so divided, can't find a way to make it right. It doesn't matter if we're a Republican or a Democrat. Are we Christians? Then it's time to do something different. Friends, it's time to make a change, to take a step towards one another, to overcome the division which we have allowed to fester among us. It means not being childish, but childlike. To find our way back to that hope which we left on the playground, and to not be afraid to run with it, to take a step towards one another. Our children will show us how. Children don't see those divisions, they're taught them. Children are willing to take a step out and knock on a neighbor's door to invite someone new to play. We teach them to fear. Maybe we can take a lesson from their book, from those games they play, and just take a step towards someone else. One person this week, maybe we can take a step towards. The whole point of the Christian faith is to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. But the truth is, we have to know our neighbor to love our neighbor. That's what this week is about. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday night, we have something different on this lawn under the tent. We're leaving our church building and starting to get to know our neighbors. We have the ridiculous and the sublime, different music, goat yoga, escape rooms, stuff to be doing under here, but it culminates on Thursday evening with a harken back to that moment when we used to play together in the neighborhood. Hopscotch has been played for centuries in neighborhoods around the world. Maybe it's time to play it in ours. It might sound silly given all that's going on in the world to stop and to play a game together, but friends, we have to start somewhere. And maybe by just stopping and playing together, we might realize that there is more that unites us than divides us. Maybe it's going to look a little foolish, but you know what? It's worth the risk. The only way we can overcome the divisions of this world is by taking a step towards one another. It will mean putting down our phones, logging off our Facebook pages. It will mean letting go of the cynicism that has overwhelmed us and picking back up that hope we left on the playground. After all, when something's lost, sometimes it's best to just go back to that place where we last remember having it and then retrace our steps. We might not find it, but by God's grace, we might learn something along the way. Here's to hoping, or in this case, hopping. Amen.